You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, the best in paranormal talk radio in the UK and around the world.
Once you've ruled out the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true.
And it is not a question of a little occultism or a touch of mysticism, Mr. Benton. It is vampires. There's a host of damned souls at Cannon House.
I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night.
Here, the old gods aren't dead.
And what of the true god?
He's dead. Can't complain.
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
You're listening to Paranormal UK Radio.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Paranormal UK Radio Show, the flagship show here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm Mark Johnson, and normally I am joined by our host, Irene Allen. Unfortunately, she's not able to be here right now. And I want to take an opportunity to explain to those of you who follow us what's been going on the last few months. This is the first show that we're doing for the 2024 season. And the reason it's taken so long had to do with several medical issues that sprung up between both myself and Irene. Even though we're on different sides of the pond, each of us has been dealing with something. Now, her issues I don't feel at liberty to discuss. She wants to bring it up the next time she's on, she can. But for me, it all started New Year's Day. New Year's Day, I got sick with COVID. So I was down and out for a couple of weeks. Then, 2 weeks later, had a heart attack. And that took me by surprise. Thankfully, it was a mild heart attack, but still, they did a catheterization on me to see if they could put in some stents, and they found that the blockages were so severe, they brought me in for a quintuple bypass surgery. So I spent a couple of weeks in the hospital, then a couple more weeks recuperating at my sister-in-law's house because I couldn't be alone. Finally, I came home, and I would be back sooner, but I was dealing with this weird, horrible cough that wouldn't go away. And I kept complaining to my doctors about it, and nobody really seemed to be taking it seriously. I finally had to go in and really complain, and they put me on some prednisone steroids, and it knocked it right out. Now, I still get little coughing fits here and there. You can hear my voice has a little bit of a, huskiness to it. But I'm much, much better. I've got a clean bill of health. I've been told to go out and live life, which is what I intend to do. And we are going to be moving forward with the Paranormal UK Radio Show. I'm lining up some great guests for the future. We have a great guest tonight that I can't wait to tell you about. And hopefully Irene is able to join me by the next show. So we're getting back into the saddle, and better late than never. So we're going to move forward from here. So I want to introduce tonight's guest. And he has been a guest with us before in the past. It's author Ron Felber. Now, Ron is a graduate of Georgetown University, Loyola University, and Drew University, where he earned his doctorate. He began writing stories for True Detective magazine, and he also has written several other books. Now, the one book we had him on the show for was the Mojave Incident, which, if you haven't read that book, oh God, you need to go read it. That is one of the most wild and intense stories of a UFO alien encounter. And I don't necessarily call it an abduction, but what this couple who were camping out in the Mojave Desert in California went through really is incredible. So right now, we're having him on for his brand new book, which is titled The Unwelcomed, The Curious Case of Clara Fowler, which is based on a true medical case history passed on to Ron by no less than William Peter Blatty, the author of the original Exorcist. And this is another tale of demonic possession based on real case study. And we're excited to talk to him about it. So, Ron, welcome to the program. Ron, how are you doing?
I'm doing just fine, Mark. It's good to be on your show again. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been quite a while. When we had last had you on for your book, The Mojave Incident, and just a moment ago, I was raving about it. That had to be one of the most, I don't know how to describe it. It's so unbelievable in so many different ways to think that actually happened to that couple, and the high strangeness. And I mean, there was some high strangeness
exactly
associated with that case was just, I want to say it's almost unbelievable, but I believe it. It's just, it's amazing. And how much of that was real? How much of that was screen memories?
No, it was real. I mean, everything, this is what happened. I mean, I met the Hesses through a friend. I was CEO of a company at the time, and I hired a salesman in California, and we became friends. So when I was on the East Coast, he was on the West, and when we would meet to work, we'd have dinner because we were friendly, and talk about families and whatever. And he said, I know you're a writer, and I published a number of books at that time even, and he said, I have this story. The people don't want to talk about it, but he's my best friend. I played football with him in college. He's an all-league football player. He's married to the most delightful woman you could imagine. They have 2 children. He's got a great job. He's a management, a construction manager for shopping malls and large projects. So salt of the earth kind of people. They don't want to talk about it because it's so upsetting. On the other hand, you're a writer. I trust you. I know that it would be helpful to them to tell their story. So reluctantly, I didn't really want to write a book about alien abduction. It really wasn't on my radar screen at the time. And I said, all right, look, it's a friend of yours. If you say it's a great story, etc. So I met them, and they told me the very beginning, reluctantly though, I must say, the very beginning of the story, and a UFO that was the size of a football field. And as soon as I heard that, I was like you. I said, let me visualize this. A UFO the size of a football field. He goes, yeah, we were in a valley in the Mojave Desert, the mountains around us, and it literally capped the valley. And at that stage of the game, I said, maybe this is just crazy. But then he continued, described the terrible nightmares they were experiencing, the sexual dysfunction, insomnia, no appetite, really all of the symptoms, let's say, of a POW returning from war. where you've been deprived of freedom and deprived of food, etc. Just really, really shaken to the core. And I said, well, I have to take this seriously. And I did. And we took them to the National Center of Psychiatry in Washington, D.C., where they were evaluated. They were not prone to fantasy. They were not, had any mental illness. They were very fact-based, successful, and, straightforward individuals. Then I took them for a lie detector test, which they both passed. And then finally I had them retrogressed for the part of the abduction that they didn't remember and were having horrible nightmares about. So I totally understand where you're coming from, but I taped them for hours and hours, and everything that's in the book came from the tapes. So it is fact-based.
Wow. Well, I recommend, if anybody wants to hear more about that book, it is in our archives. So if you go to our, mainly on our account, anywhere that our platform, Apple Music, Spreaker, everywhere, you can just do a search on Ron Felber and the interview will come up. And you can listen to that one. But now today we're here to talk about the Unwelcomed, or the curious case of Clara Fowler.
Yes. And
there seems to be tell us a little bit how you came about to write about this book and your approach to writing it.
Sure. Well, it's a great story, really, because I first came upon this story in 1972, when William Peter Blatty was filming The Exorcist at Georgetown University. I was a sophomore in college there, and I was a writer even then. I'd been writing short stories and writing, things, and I had my first book, my first novel. So I said to myself, here's a guy who has a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list, The Exorcist, for 56 weeks. I've got to meet this guy. I want to be a writer desperately. I have my first novel. Maybe he'll read it. I can get him to read it. He'll like it and help me get it published. So they were filming, he and Billy Friedkin and the crew at Georgetown. And I couldn't meet him because everything was cordoned off and police and whatnot, for the filming. But I knew I'd learned that he had an office in Arlington, Virginia, right across the Key Bridge, right across the Potomac River from Georgetown. So I went there, I met with his administrative assistant, and I brought my manuscript, and I said, I really, really would appreciate it if you could give this to Mr. Blatty and ask him to read it. And if he likes it very much, there's a phone number there, and maybe he could contact me because I'd love to discuss it with him. So she said, well, I have about 100 manuscripts behind me from all over the world of young writers, old writers, middle-aged writers, whatever, that want to get their book to Mr. Blatty so that he'll help them publish it. I'll put it in the pile. I said, no, please don't do that. I like him, I'm a student at Georgetown, and I'm here in front of you. I'm not sending this by mail. I'm handing it to you personally. I said, I come from Newark, New Jersey. That's where I grew up. He grew up in the Bronx. We were both here on scholarship for writing. I'm very much like he was 20 years ago. So please tell him that. Tell him that I am William Peter Blatty, only younger. and please look at my book. So she said, I'll tell you what. I'll give it to him and tell you what I said. After that, it's up to him, and and we'll leave it at that. But I promise you, I will hand it to him personally. So as it turns out, he called me. He did call me at home over Thanksgiving holiday in New Jersey, and told me he liked the book. We met. He didn't help me get that book published, but he helped me get a different book published. But more than that, he gave me the idea and gifted me the story for The Unwelcomed, the curious case of Clara Fowler. he had been researching The Exorcist and came across a case at Harvard University Medical School that happened in 1898 to 1904, where a young Radcliffe student came to Dr. Morton Prince and William James, the famous William James, the father really of abnormal psychiatry, and Richard Hodgson and Dr. George Waterman, a team that was formed to study this woman who had all of the signs of demonic possession. Her voice would change to a man's voice, this horrific, explosive voice. Her face would remold. She had the strength of 10 men. She exhibited clairvoyance and spoken languages that she had no way of knowing, and raged at religious objects, the Bible, rosary beads, church. They studied her in this second state at great, took great pains to study as scientists would. The second consciousness, as they called it, the demon, experienced no pain, no need of food or sleep, experienced no illness, experienced no fatigue, and was awake 24/7.
So the girl's body could withstand all that?
Well, that's really a very interesting point, because what happened was the demonic presence knew or learned that the weaker the body was, the easier it was for it to come in control of the body. And so the demon made a practiced regimen of keeping her awake at night with incredibly horrible nightmares. So she was afraid to go to sleep. When she tried to eat, maggots would be in her food, and she would visualize maggots, hallucinate maggots in her food, so she wouldn't eat. And it would she would have missing time, where the demonic presence would take her on walks, long walks, sometimes without shoes, etc. And she'd wake up hours later, not knowing where she was or how she got there, and she'd have to figure out her way home. At night, she would wake up in the morning to letters that the demonic presence would write. As a matter of fact, I have one of them right here. Hypocrite, whore, how I hate you. The pains of hell shall come down upon thee. You shall find no help, no comfort in heaven or hell, heaven or earth from my wrath. Not till student Clara is dead and puts a bullet through her head. Devil, devil, devil.
Whoa.
So yeah, she was on the verge of total physical collapse through much of this, and they tried every method available to them, and eventually wound up going to exorcism. Yeah, crazy story. Really an incredible story. Again, this was a young woman, 22 years old, from Radcliffe College, documented to the T, because Prince had a stenographer there for the hypnotic sessions and for the psychiatric sessions. There were letters between them like that, letters from the demonic presence to her. All of this was like a treasure trove of information at the Harvard Medical School library, where Bill Blatty had called ahead to the curator and said, I have a young man that's writing a book. I'd appreciate it if you would allow him into the library and give him access to all these records.
Fantastic. There's a couple of interesting things. One question is, you chose to write this book as more of a novel.
Yes.
In fiction, instead of like going through and recounting as like a documentary. Wow. Why did you choose that outlet?
That's another great question, because I did try to do it as a documentary. So I was 20, let me think, 19, 21, maybe 22 years old myself when I tried to write it after Blatty. I did the research. I had tons of research, probably too much research, really, from my standpoint, because it was overwhelming. And as a young writer who'd really been writing like spy novels, action adventure stories, things that took place today, in the current environment, as opposed to 1898 or 1904 when the case ended. So I tried it as a documentary, but frankly, I just didn't have the talent to pull it off. It's very difficult to do either way, but the documentary came off like a medical textbook, and I didn't want that because it really, as dramatic and incredible as the story was fact by fact, it needed more than just to say this is what happened. It needed to be told like a story. So, for example, if we took history and I told you about, I don't know, the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon and Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo, and I just gave you facts. It happened on this date. It was a sunny day. It was a cloudy day. Napoleon is 5'7" tall. It really gives you information, but it doesn't give you the feeling. It doesn't give you the soul of what went on. And so much later, after I failed at writing it the first time, I about 3 years ago, I said, I have all this information. This has got to be the best story I've ever come across. Let me try it with a different voice. And the voice would be something like, Mark, you're next to me in a coffee shop. I have a cup of coffee and you have a cup of coffee. And I say, Mark, I'm going to tell you a story that is incredible. It's the most documented story of demonic possession probably ever. And it started like this. That's a kind of voice, a storytelling voice that allows you some room in terms of feelings. A documentary doesn't give you that, like fear, the terror this woman experienced, the depression, the idea that she was literally in hell and couldn't get out. Those kind of expressions, that what I just told you, don't really have a place in a documentary, but those kind of expression of feelings and emotions and things like fear, things like anticipation, you can do. So I call it a novel, but it's a novel based on a true story.
Blatty himself, when he wrote The Exorcist, even though he wrote it as a novel, he based it on a case in the 1950s where a boy was possessed. So he was able to take elements of that, create the novel, then actually the screenplay, which for me, it's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Yeah.
Because of the approach William Friedkin took, which was not to direct it like a horror movie, but direct it like a documentary.
Exactly. So really it's the combination, which is tricky business. They call it narrative fiction. But the tricky business is to do something that's fact-based in a way that's enticing. And by the way, the case, it was 1949 in Maryland, the case of the boy that was possessed. But one of the other cases that Bill Blatty used for The Exorcist was the Clara Fowler case.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's how he came upon it, in his research for the book and the movie.
Well, some of the elements that you had mentioned that that Clara exhibited when she was being, going through therapy, and the voice changes and the physical changes, all of these wild things that are beyond belief. And they happened at a time when America was actually going through this spiritualism type
Correct.
of revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of it would be much more open to the public than, say, going through the 1950s and forward, where everything turned much more religious conservative. And
mm-hmm. Yes, actually, to your point, Prince, when he assembled the team that would study her in this case, chose William James. And William James, like I said, is really the father. He's the first person to teach abnormal psychology at anywhere in the United States, but he taught it at Harvard Medical School. And most people consider William James something of a genius. Dr. Morton Prince, who was the primary doctor, and he was a Harvard Medical School graduate that had a practice and also taught and lectured at Tufts University. Dr. George Waterman And George Waterman was a Harvard graduate and Prince's protege, an heir to the Waterman Penn dynasty, I guess you'd call it. Also, because of what you're saying with spiritualism, he added to the team Dr. Richard Hodgson, who was the president of the American Psychical Society, Research Society, and a spiritualist, and also Leonora Piper, who was a clairvoyant. So to cover that base, because if he just took it from a clinical standpoint, people would say, well, you've directed this towards your theories of medicine. So he wanted to get a kind of consensus and different points of view on what was happening, because it was truly a phenomenon.
Now, in a lot of possession cases, at least ones that I've heard of, the person who becomes, first there's oppression and then possession. And usually, sometimes the person goes through something very traumatic earlier in their life. There was also the late Father Malachi Martin,
yes,
who always proclaimed that, well, the person invited it in.
Yes.
The demons couldn't come in unless they invited him in. So what did you find with Clara's case?
Well, this is, I think, maybe one of the reasons that Bill Blatty didn't pursue this story and went on to something else was because he looked at it as a classic case of demonic possession, and that served his purposes in terms of writing The Exorcist. However, there's much, much more to this story than the possession itself. As a matter of fact, there were 3 murders involved. And basically, I call this a story of science, murder, and the paranormal. And Clara's father was an alcoholic and a wife beater and abusive, and probably abusive to her. There's certainly, fertile ground for that thought that she was abused, probably sexually. Her brother and sister, Bessie and Charles, both died under suspicious circumstances. So that actually, when she was being treated by Dr. Prince, there was a city marshal named Rufus Bassett. They called him Bassett, a nickname like a basset hound. Rufus Bassett Hilliard. And Bassett Hilliard was the investigator for the Lizzie Borden murders in Fall River, and also for the Axe murders, and also for the Juan Corriero murders, which happened, believe it or not, within a 6-month time frame, and within a couple of miles of the Lizzie Borden murders, where Juan Corriero, a Portuguese farm worker, went into the kitchen of his boss and axe murdered his wife. Clara Fowler's brother and sister, Bessie and Charles, died, as I said, under mysterious circumstances. And the city marshal, Rufus Bassett Hilliard, was convinced that her father murdered her brother and sister. And so he went to Boston looking to have Clara testify against her father, and then came to find out that she's in Boston all right, a student at Radcliffe, though she had to drop out, but being treated for what appears to be demonic possession by Dr. Morton Prince.
Was there any, after the fact, any suspicion that maybe she did it under the influence?
Well, I mean, I won't get into that, but I will tell you this. Lizzie Borden had no memory of killing her mother or father. And one of the reasons she was acquitted, though Bassett knew she was the murderess, because he had evidence that couldn't be submitted in court, but he was convinced she was the murderess. Nevertheless, she had no memory of it. And so when questioned, the only thing she was adamant about was that she didn't know what happened. And that was pretty believable to a jury. one Corriero, who also committed an axe murder right within the same 4 or 5 mile radius as the Fowler murders or children, the Borden murder, he had no knowledge of the murder or remembrance, and actually went to town and bought a pair of shoes directly following the murder. So you have, two people all in Fall River, all within a very small geographical radius that where there's violence, this violence that really society had never seen before, occurring in a small industrial town, Fall River, Massachusetts, not far from Boston.
There's elements to all of that. You may or may not agree with me, but it's just hitting me because I'm familiar with Blatty's later work, especially the follow-up novel, Legion, which they made the movie Exorcist 3, which great movie in a lot of ways. Of course, what they had to put up with studio interference. Oh, geez. But like the idea of something going and possessing people and causing these murders or causing mayhem, and then the people having no knowledge of it.
Yeah, that's not so unusual. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you know this about me, Mark, but I was a deputy sheriff for over 3.5 years or so in the Washington, D.C. area, and I transported federal prisoners. And, a frequent question I get is demonic possession real? And I can tell you demonic possession is very real. It's not necessarily, it's not necessarily a name like Lizzie Borden or somebody famous, Jack the Ripper or H.H. Holmes. It's not necessarily names that you would know. But if you looked into the eyes of a guy, for example, and I don't want to be too graphic, but a Hell's Angel who kidnapped and tortured to death a 14-year-old girl, you meet somebody like that, and believe me, you'll believe in demonic possession.
Interesting. The idea of demonic possession actually is ages old, goes all the way back to biblical days.
Yes.
In fact, I don't know if you ever watched the TV show The Chosen. They deal with it several times. I actually like the way that they dealt with it in the show. But for the longest time, you don't really hear too much about it or other cases throughout history. And it really, even with this case, didn't get a lot of press, or at least not being in the public consciousness these last 50, 60 years, not like The Exorcist did. And people, was there really a lot going on at that time? I mean, how often would you say, if that there was people dealing with actual demonic possession?
Well, I'll take it from two standpoints. One is that you don't hear about demonic possession much anymore, but in fact, demonic possession has been on the rise for the last 20 years. The Vatican, as a matter of fact, began an order of priests that do nothing but exorcisms. So in the United States, if you went back 15 or 20 years, there would have been a handful of exorcists that had been trained by the Vatican. And they upped that number to the point where right now it's over 150. In terms of the Fowler case, so exorcism is not only around, it's been on the rise for quite some time. Maybe it's just something that you don't hear about much, but and it's not just Catholics. It's there's all kinds. You just go to YouTube, you'll see all kinds of cases about current demonic possession. The other point I wanted to make was about the Fowler case. One of the things I mentioned to you was this issue with Facebook, where I'd said in a video that this was a case that the medical establishment did not want you to know. Well, basically, as you pointed out, At the turn of the century, there were two schools of thought, well, really three. One was spiritualism, and there were 9 million spiritualists at the time in the United States and Europe. So that's a fair number. And they were successful people. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, Charles Dickens, Madame Curie, Pierre Curie, the founders of X-rays, Sir Joseph Lodge, a physicist, from England. So there were really mainstream names, scientists and thinkers that were spiritualists. William James was one of them. Believed that you could contact, that there was a spirit world, etc. So that was one school of thought, and that was anathema to Prince, who was a behavioralist. He believed that there were physical causes, physical origins for symptoms that were displayed. So, for example, schizophrenia. He would say it has nothing to do with psychoanalysis and what Freud would be talking about with sexual fantasies and childhood repression, etc. He thought that was garbage, rubbish is what he called it in an article. He believed that there were physical causes, the things that caused mental illness were physical, imbalances, chemical imbalances in the brain, lesions, things of that nature. And then there was Freud, who had just written Interpretations of a Dream in 1901, which took the world by storm, the medical community by storm. And he became, a celebrity, and his views on psychoanalysis were considered gospel. Prince totally disagreed and thought that this case, if he could show that this woman who had all the symptoms of demonic possession, which goes back, as you say, thousands of years to the Bible, probably before, if he could show that this was a disease that had a physical cause to it, that it was maybe as a form of hysteria or a form of some kind of epilepsy, that if he could prove that, he would overshadow Freud, and that was for his own ego, and set the direction for psychiatry going forward into the 20th century. As a result of that, he really skewed in his book, which he wrote in 1906, Dissociation of a Personality. He skewed it and left out big, meaty chunks of what went on that the records revealed. He also disguised the woman's name, changed a lot of the detail to disguise her name, because Clara Fowler wound up marrying one of the doctors that treated her, one of the members of Prince's team, Dr. George Waterman. She wound up marrying him and becoming a socialite, one of the Beacon Hill socialites. So to keep her name disguised and to put, like, for example, murders and things like that, excise those from the record, really put forward a skewed version of this case, even to the point where now, if you look it up in a medical textbook, the case of the disguised name was Christine Beecham. If you were to look that up, it would talk about the demon as a character named Sally, who was mischievous, who was a rebel, who created havoc, but not someone who was capable of murder, not someone who wanted to kill the host, Clara Fowler. So it took on a whole different spin, because they wanted to spin it away from spiritualism, away from psychoanalysis, but mostly spiritualism, into the realm of modern psychiatry and science.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. From that time period, everything was starting to change over towards being more scientifically based.
Yes.
But yet you're dealing with phenomenon that defies scientific explanation, especially with the, as you pointed out, the the time, the missing time, the voice changes, the physical changes to her face.
Yes.
How can you explain that through scientific means?
Yeah. There's a debate that goes on, and this is one of the charms, I think, of the book, is that that it really is viewed from a couple points of view. One is Hodgson, the psychic researcher, and Prince, the materialist scientist. If I may, I'd just like to maybe read a short clip from it that shows Hodgson and Prince arguing about this.
Sure, could be my guest.
So this is Dr. Morton Prince talking to Hodgson and the group. Throughout the ages, diseases of the mind have been falsely labeled demonic possession by those who would have us believe supernatural entities creep into the natural world. Ghosts, witches, devils. Have we learned nothing from the work of Charcot on the pathology of hysteria and epilepsy? Think for a moment about the poor souls subjected to unspeakable tortures. Women burned at the stake here in Massachusetts, no less, in the name of religion and belief in evil incarnate. When, as Tourette proved, the symptoms associated with Tourette syndrome have nothing to do with demons and everything to do with a chemical imbalance in the brain. Now Hodgson argues, listen, please, we have a set of symptoms manifested by a second consciousness. As proved by you, it takes possession of Miss Fowler's body, claiming to be spirit, despises her, threatens her, and has driven her to the brink of destruction. Given these facts, one can label her disorder anything one chooses, but a name doesn't explain a phenomenon that's existed in every corner of the world for thousands of years. Gregory of Tours, who reported the possession of a young girl who took on not only the voice but the appearance of a Persian man who died decades before. The 17th century case of Elizabeth Knapp, who read her exorcist thoughts predicting future events through messages spontaneously erupting on her body. And today, the anthropologist Junot's account of a possessed woman in Africa who vanished from her home one night and was found the following morning on top of a tree. Afterwards, she glided down headfirst, flicking her tongue in and out like a serpent. She then hung suspended for a time and began to speak in a language later identified as Aramaic. How do you account for these? Prince. Anecdotes. That's what you're putting forward, Hodgson. Where are the doctors? Where are the clinicians? Scientists who would document these stories. Without that, we have what we always have in spiritualist arguments. Hearsay, fraud, misunderstood symptoms, leading to misdiagnosis and mythology. To that I say, angels, ghosts, hobgoblins, show me your face. Hodgson stepped up to him, pleading, don't you see, Morton? Can you not bring yourself to understand the great mystery we stand on the threshold of solving? I beg you consider at least the possibility that here at last, in the city of Boston, 1898, is tangible evidence of transcendence. If there are demons, there must be angels, and probably a God and a life everlasting. You ask me where are the doctors and clinicians. Dr. Prince, we are the doctors. We are the clinicians.
Very, very good arguments.
Yeah, and they are, because it almost depends. It almost depends a lot like, alien abduction and all of it. What lens do you want to look through to see it? If you're looking through a scientific lens, again, you look at something like light. We just call it light. We don't really know what light is. We say that it's waves of energy, but we don't see, for example, infrared light. We don't see microwaves. We don't see radio waves or, so at the end, what we see is a very, very limited view of the world through a particular lens. And as he says, like what you want to call it, you call it what you want. Call an angel, call it an interdimensional being, call it a demon, call it an evil interdimensional being. These are just labels, but at the end, the point is they exist. That's the point.
That's something that's been fascinating me, and where my research has branched off into these last few years, because with, I've studied the paranormal for many years. I've done my investigations, and my point of view has changed so much because what we're dealing with is our perception of reality, which is like you mentioned, it's like looking at the visible light spectrum, what our eyes can see, where there's so much going on either direction in the electromagnetic spectrum. Yet we hold, and especially science holds that, well, our reality is anything that we can bring into the lab, look under a microscope, or be able to repeat results or whatnot, when the true nature of our reality is way more out there and crazy sounding than people realize.
Absolutely.
When you start talking about interdimensional beings, you start talking about the idea of multiple dimensions, creatures that come in and out of existence, like what was documented on the Skinwalker Ranch.
Yes.
Reality is far more stranger than we can imagine.
Exactly. And, I'm just reading a book called The Case Against Reality. And this fellow, quoting Francis Crick, the founder, co-founder of DNA, he said the chances that we have any idea what reality really is zero.
Yep, exactly.
We have no idea. But my conclusion in looking at all of this is that we see a very tiny pinhole into what we call reality. Even if what we see is real is questionable. But point being, I would suggest that 99% of reality as human beings know it is spiritual.
Or what we would interpret as spiritual.
Yes, or what we would interpret as spirit. In other words, invisible to the eye. How about
higher or even lower frequencies? Everything is energy.
Yes.
Everything is vibration. We are able to experience certain vibrations, but there are some that are outside of our senses. Like you have, I'm having trouble remembering here. You have ultra low frequencies that are below human hearing, but they can cause physical reactions in a person. Yes. Ultrasound, infrasound. And same thing with light. We can't see infrared light, but now we have cameras and scopes that can see into the infrared spectrum for night vision. And yes. Now they have some ultraviolet technology that can view a different light spectrum, but it's still very, very narrow. One of the things also, again, as an investigator, and you can tell me your thoughts on this, because you mentioned how there are more cases of demonic possession, but one of the issues that I've had in the last 20 years is the demonic is so popular in especially Western culture, especially in America, where all the TV shows and all of the movies, everything is demonic. That's what sells, that extreme fear. When in all the years that I've been investigating, I've never encountered what I would consider be a demonic case. People would call me up freaking out over something, and then I find out they've watched too many episodes of Ghost Hunters, one of these other shows, and there's nothing really there. Or if there's something there, it's nothing to be afraid of. Yeah. There's also, we did this long-standing case over here in Bloomingdale where multiple houses on the same street were experiencing activity.
I see.
And we we took years. We went back over a few years investigating. Whatever was there was attached to the land. It wasn't human, and it had qualities that were negative at times. Others that were it was just there, maybe mischievous. Something that people would call an elemental. I've also I did investigations one time down deep in a cave in Colorado where no record of anybody ever dying. The furthest area back in the cave we were allowed to go, we did an investigation, and I had so many things happening. And then it hit me. Why is this cave showing paranormal activity? I even got voices on EVP saying, get out.
Yeah.
And it took a while to realize that probably we weren't dealing with human spirits at all. We're dealing with something else, some type of elemental, things that live underground. Old miners used to talk about Tommy knockers and things in the mines, things that live underground, and things in the natural world that appear paranormal to us, but are still a part of our reality.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can call it primordial, but I mean, in my view, the battle between good and evil goes on moment to moment, with humans sort of in the middle, and the prize being, if you want to call it the souls, the spirits, the life of human beings in the balance. And I believe that inside us we're tugged to this direction or that, but in some cases, you have a Mother Teresa tugged in one direction, and in another you have Jack the Ripper tugged in another. But at these extremes, you look at something that you might call a saint, and in the other extreme, you look at something that might be called demonic.
Interesting. There are, trying to figure out how to make this point. There are a lot of cases of people who report near-death experiences.
Yes.
And I've been watching a lot of videos of people recounting their near-death experiences lately. And again, that's a whole nother show in itself. But
in a way, it's very much related, Mark, because it talks about a spiritual world, a spirit world, a world that's different. The other world, as Aldous Huxley called it.
See, my view of it, and it's my personal view, is the fact that these demonic possessions, these demons, put the body through hell, put the person through hell, torment them, and to the point of where the goal is for them to die. And yet, I also believe our souls, our spirits are immortal.
Yes.
And we come back many times. So I've always likened some of these darker entities, the demons or whatever we want to call them.
Yes.
More as like an intelligent parasite, because they attach themselves to a person.
That's really a good point. Yeah.
And feed off their energy, and they do everything to create negative emotions, negative feelings, scare the hell out of people, because that's what they feed off of. And the more they can scare the person or torture them, or even like say a household of people, they feed off of that negative energy and get stronger and stronger. When the person dies, they just move on to the next victim.
Yes. As a matter of fact, there's an interesting dialogue in the book where Leonora Piper asked the demonic presence, why do you do this? And basically, the answer is this: why do I bother with a pathetic blank like Clara Fowler? I do it because it's my job. God is dead, Jesus in hell. Yet moment to moment we fight for the souls of humans, sometimes by the thousands, often one at a time, each a small or momentous victory, and we celebrate those victories, he swore. Truly we do. And then she utters, God, a tired general, incompetent, blithering. Angels have lost confidence in him, knowing the power of the forces I command. I think the English would say he let his side down. It crept toward her. Another secret, it croaked. Most are borderline, but occasionally we come upon a special case, Borden, Holmes, the Ripper, countless others whose names you'll never know, and these by their own choosing become me, evil incarnate, prowling the earth with one purpose, to reduce God's so-called creations to the brutish animals I know them to be.
That is utterly fascinating.
Thank you.
That is utterly fascinating. To hear that kind of perspective, supposedly. Now, that was that taken from actual transcripts?
What happened with that is a lot of the language is older English, like whence and whilst and things like that. Mm-hmm. So it's the language that I've changed, not the message.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. In all the time that she was being treated, how long was she suffering from this until she had the exorcism?
Well, actually, yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the exorcism in a moment. But to answer your question, the entire process took from 1898 to 1904, so basically 6 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was a horror story from her point of view, to say the least. In terms of the exorcism, Hodgson, wanted to have an exorcism. So did Piper, of course. That's their point of view, the lens they look at this through. Waterman and Prince, the materialist, did an exorcism, but it was Prince that did the exorcism, and he used the language and Bible and whatnot for an exorcism, but he did it himself. And the idea was that if she believed she was possessed by a demon, an exorcism would work based on shock value. Of course, Hodgson looked at it from a very different point of view, in that the exorcism would send the demonic presence back to hell.
Very
and it
interesting.
To a point. The Clara Fowler, displayed all kinds of clairvoyance and incredible strength and violence, incredible violence. But at the end, the demon sort of surrendered and basically said, I have better things to do with my time than this.
Okay, I guess the demon got bored.
Well, actually, it was the second demon. It started with a lesser demon, Abaddon was the name, and then which means changer of shapes in Greek, and then it moved on to a much higher presence. I call it Satan, although it was never identified as Satan per se. But this was a different presence, and one that was, let's say, not so brutish and a lot more clever. And this was, and by the way, had designs on World War I.
Okay.
He was talking about his vision of the world, And his vision of the world was, was absolute slaughter, massacre.
When you mentioned that the demon was more cunning, for me, in the original movie, The Exorcist, for me, the scenes that I was most fascinated with was the conversations with the demon.
Exactly.
And even though, he was obviously screwing with Karras's head.
Yes.
But yet at the same time is just revealing the personality. I don't know. I just always liked that better than pea soup and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, really, one of the charms about the Unwelcomed, I think, is just that really you have full-blown dialogues, and you really sort of catch an insight into what evil is about, and that evil is something that exists, and it doesn't have much to do with pea soup, although there are cases like that. What it has to do with is just viciousness, violence, and a bedlam, I guess, something like that.
Wow. Well, I'm actually looking forward. I had started reading some of the book, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest because now you got me really hooked. And I'm definitely looking forward to that. Now, the Unwelcomed, where can people find your book?
Well, I'll tell you what, the Unwelcomed, the Curious Case of Clara Fowler, Ron Felber. It's on Amazon right now. It can be ordered on Amazon. It can be ordered on Barnes & Noble and any of the online bookstores, and it will be distributed next month into regular bookstores, concrete and mortar buildings. But you can get it online right now.
Excellent. Okay. I think I'm going to pick me up a hardcover copy of it. Anyway, Ron, thank you so much for coming back on. This has been very enlightening and chilling.
It's a scary book. It really is a scary book. My wife read it and said she didn't sleep for 3 nights. So I guess that's some kind of a testimony.
Well, hopefully people get out there and get your book, and I hope it's a great success for you. And we'll have to have you on again in the near future.
I'd sure like that a lot, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Ron, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in to another edition of the Paranormal UK Radio Show, the flagship show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. And normally I'd ask Irene, where could people find us? And she would tell you everywhere. All the platforms you can find our network and our show. So we will be back in a couple weeks with another new show. So we look forward to talking to you all then. Hopefully Irene will be back with me at that time. And take care of yourselves, be good humans, and we'll talk to you soon.